Chapter 8: Bodies on the Line, the Culture of a Movement. If one word had to be chosen to characterize the culture of the new communist movement, that word would be intense. The sheer amount of time, passion, and energy that movement cadre threw into political work made movement life nearly all-consuming. Today it is fashionable to attribute such single-mindedness to some combination of top-down structures, ideological brainwashing, and psychological aberration. But the willingness, indeed eagerness, of young Marxist-Leninists to devote most of their waking hours to revolutionary activity was not the result of manipulation, orders from above, or unmet emotional needs. It was the expression of deeply held convictions. Even at the height of late 60s radicalism, it was no casual, risk-free, or faddish decision to declare oneself a communist. Those who turned to party building weighed their options carefully and decided that the only way to realize their dreams of a better world was to build an organization capable of waging revolutionary struggle. Radicalized amid surging mass movements, these young people had come to eat, sleep, and dream politics. They had the enthusiasm and intellectual curiosity of youth. They had grown accustomed to enduring official hostility and often jail and police violence. That activism required sacrifice was a given. It was the notion of a meaningful political life without sacrifice that seemed wildly unrealistic. Of particular importance, those who adopted Marxism-Leninism internalized a commitment to fighting racism and imperialism that transcended all matters of doctrine and orthodoxy, though many decided later that orthodoxy was the key to success. This commitment went beyond notions of support for the struggles of the oppressed or alliances between people of different backgrounds. Cadre of all colors considered themselves an integral part of a universal community of revolutionary peoples. This movement, we crossed racial and geographic borders. That was a key part of its early moral authority and political appeal. Voluntarism as Marxism-Leninism movement cadre also had a self-confident, can-do attitude. Coming of age at a time when protests often doubled in size from one month to the next, they were accustomed to shaking up those in power and seeing the left grow. The downside of this quality was pervasive voluntarism. Generalizing from their 1960s experience, most cadre believed that history always moved fast, and that they could make it move even faster with enough dedication and the right ideas. The turn to Marxism-Leninism was supposed to replace New Left idealism with scientific materialism, but in many ways it simply reinforced the New Left's voluntarism, the side of Marxism that emphasized socialism's inevitable victory, and the aspect of Leninism that stressed the unique role of the vanguard, buttressed notions that this young movement could move mountains. Cultural revolution Maoism, which viewed ideological transformation rather than economic development, linked to the development of grassroots empowering democratic institutions as the key to building socialism after the initial seizure of power, was especially compatible with idealist notions inherited from the New Left. The new communist movement also carried on the New Left tradition of trying to lever your political values, albeit in its own distinctive way. One current of thought, intertwined with the good 60s, bad 60s school, sees a major contrast between the early and late 1960s in terms of prefigurative politics versus strategic politics. According to that view, the early New Left believed in incorporating human values and compassion into its day-to-day work, so that its activism prefigured the liberated society of the future. In contrast, the Marxist tendencies of the late 1960s allegedly practiced only strategic politics, which were unconcerned with the quality of life or relationships among activists, who were regarded simply as cogs in a political machine. This contrast is too sharply drawn. However, the new communist movement certainly placed great value on tangible outcomes and believed in subordinating personal concerns to political tasks. But the movement expressed a prefigurative dimension in its stress on building a multiracial revolutionary community via immersion in political battle. Activists took their lead here from how they interpreted the Cultural Revolution, and to extent from Che's ideas about revolutionary enthusiasm and moral incentives. Young Marxist-Leninists envisioned the liberated community as one engaged in constant struggle, in which every member strove to become the best possible revolutionary. Toward this end, movement culture prized the creation of powerful bonds of comradeship between people of diverse backgrounds through intense collective work. For many, the feelings of loyalty, trust, and mutual support that arose out of this experience did indeed prefigure their vision of human relationships in a future liberated society. And despite grueling factional battles and the movement's collapse, many bonds formed in those years survive to this day. The point is that movement cadre saw no contradiction between political fervor, allegiance to Marxism-Leninism, giving priority to strategic objectives, and forging relationships that were harbingers of life in a socialist society. The movement's zeal was a double-edged sword. It too easily led to impatience with individuals who were unwilling or unable to make a 24-hour-a-day commitment, and contributed to political rigidity and intolerance. And later, when the movement was no longer surrounded by a large radical milieu, revolutionary zeal tended to enclose cadre in a self-contained and distorted world. But early on it inspired many activists to tap reserves of energy and imagination. It also prodded activists to develop their intellectual capacities. One of the movement's most interesting characteristics was the amount of reading, study, and exchange of ideas that went on within its ranks. Movement life broke down much of the gap between theoretical exploration and grassroots activism that has long plagued U.S. radicalism. The new communist movement encouraged workers and youth who had never set foot on a college campus to read books and debate theory, while pressing its professors and ex-graduate students to take up activist campaigns. The movement's contribution in this area was one reason that the gap between the academic and grassroots left in the 1970s was not nearly as wide as it is today. Movement zeal also motivated many individuals to look critically at their own prejudices and egoism. Their high level of commitment made movement cadre willing to engage in self-criticism, not only to learn better organizing skills but to unlearn conduct that reflected narrow individualism, or race, class, or less frequently, gender privilege. Self-transformation was seen as an integral, if subordinate, aspect of social transformation. In the early 1970s, a culture based on fierce commitment, can-do attitudes, and linking self and social transformation was not restricted to Marxist-Leninists. It pervaded all revolutionary tendencies, and even many who advocated reform within the system functioned with a level of cadre commitment that appears exceptional by today's standards. The assumption that changing the world required submitting individual behaviors to group examination was, for example, at least as widespread within the radical wings of the gay, lesbian, and women's movements as among Marxist-Leninists. Indeed, within the women's movement there was considerable overlap between activists promoting the idea that the personal is political and those most enthusiastic about Mao's dictums to practice criticism, self-criticism, and combat liberalism. Many voices then, and even more today, ridicule or dismiss all revolutionary fervor as self-righteous arrogance or youthful naivete. Some arrogance and a great deal of naivete was present in the Marxist-Leninist ranks. But what's even more naive is the belief that social transformation can come about without cadre who are willing to work endless hours, take risks, participate in disciplined collective action, and think of themselves as contributing to world historic change. Sectarian vanguardism needs to be criticized, but all too often what its critics are really rejecting is any audacious effort that requires cadre building or disrupting business as usual. The audacity of the new communist movement was one of its finest qualities. Hindsight should not be used to smugly dismiss it, but to analytically disentangle its positive from its negative side, sinking roots in the working class. Another determinant of movement culture was determination to root activists in the working class and within people of color communities. Marxist-Leninists scoffed at the notion that they could build a base for socialism through exhortation alone. Only a body of cadre immersed in working-class life and participating directly in the day-to-day struggles of ordinary people could win millions to revolutionary politics. Thus, the movement was confronted with a twofold challenge. First, its initial cadre, a disproportionate number of whom were from the middle class, needed to be integrated into working-class jobs and communities. This was sometimes termed colonization. Second, large numbers of workers, and workers of color in particular, had to be recruited into the membership and leadership ranks. Cadre from all backgrounds had to be forged into an effectively functioning team. And the movement needed to establish an atmosphere and culture that attracted workers and people of color and made them feel at home. All these things were encompassed in the movement's definition of what it meant to proletarianize. The centerpiece was ensuring that the majority of cadre, from whatever class, racial, or educational background, shared the material conditions of working-class life. This translated into most living in poor neighborhoods and getting blue-collar jobs, including the most exhausting, dangerous, and low-paying. Others sought clerical or secretarial work in large offices, or employment as nurses, aides, nurses, or clerks in hospitals and nursing homes. The relatively small proportion of cadre who were already doctors, lawyers, or college professors when they joined the movement were not generally directed to leave these positions. Instead, their skills, greater financial resources, and in the case of teachers, potential influence over students were tapped in other ways. but most activists who were still in training toward those or other advanced degrees were encouraged to leave the campuses. Many needed little pushing, alienated from academia and full of enthusiasm. Hundreds of undergraduates and dozens of graduate students set out on their own to get jobs as factory hands, laborers, bus drivers, painters, and the like. This phenomenon, too, continued a 1960s tradition going back to SNCC and the SDS Economic Research and Action Project, EROP. There was a lot of blundering about in early efforts to proletariationize, but rank-and-file activists overwhelmingly embraced this objective and persisted through numerous embarrassments and difficult transitions. Almost every anti-revisionist group gained at least a minimal foothold within working-class life. Despite the depth of the class transformation involved, many colonizers successfully implanted themselves within unions and community institutions. A significant percentage of those who stuck it out in the unions for years rose through the ranks to leadership positions. Likewise, many workers learned valuable political, organizational, and even academic skills within the movement's orbit, and utilized these not just in political efforts but to rise within trade union and other organizations, or in some cases to leap over class barriers to professional careers. Positioning cadre within certain jobs and neighborhoods was only the beginning. Activists' skills, attitudes, and behaviors had to be brought into harmony with the goal of building an advanced detachment of the proletariat. In part, this was done via aggressive efforts to develop the leadership potential of people from working-class backgrounds who had received fewer educational opportunities than their middle-class comrades. Developing workers' leadership was a major criterion in determining work assignments as well as allotting time for study of Marxist theory. Some of the more sophisticated groups paid attention to the hidden injuries of class as well, too, challenging the negative self-images society drums into the exploited and oppressed. The other side of this coin was struggling against elitist attitudes and actions displayed by activists from more privileged backgrounds. Tendencies to talk on and dominate meetings, consider themselves best suited for the most interesting assignments, reluctance to take on the shit work. These behaviors and more were targets of individual criticism and occasional organization-wide campaigns. Fighting racism and sexism, internal struggle against elitism was related to but not identical with specific efforts to combat manifestations of racism and sexism within the ranks. The movement's basic framework was that an advanced political line and all-sided revolutionary practice were the decisive elements in building unity across barriers of race and gender, but that a self-conscious cadre policy and struggle against manifestations of backwardness among communists was needed as well. It was assumed that activists' behavior and attitudes showed scars of the class-divided, racist, and sexist society from which they emerged. This was baggage to be overcome in the course of revolutionary work, and it was argued that cadre from all backgrounds had a common stake in doing so. That assumption provided the unity within which criticisms could be raised of individuals who exhibited prejudice or insensitivity, in keeping with the predominant consensus that racism was the principal obstacle to working-class unity. Internal struggles against racism generally received the most attention. The more sophisticated groups worked hard to educate all cadre in the importance of these struggles and to find ways to take them up aggressively but without fostering individual scapegoating or subjectivity. It was argued that the most common error in the history of the communist movement was to neglect the fight against racism, but that it was also a mistake to hold that racist contradictions among communists manifest themselves with the same identical degree of antagonism as in the broader society. On this basis, organizational bodies were mandated to be vigilant against manifestations of racism, to encourage forthright and timely criticisms if problems arose, and to periodically review each unit's level of anti-racist consciousness. Serious attempts were made to go beyond generalities and probe the concrete dynamics of building a multiracial movement. For instance, in terms of cadre policy concerning recruitment, promotion, and training, the social and class dynamics in U.S. society are extremely complex and diverse. Of course, this holds true for racism. The experience of racial and national oppression is thoroughly bound up with class and has fundamentally framed the life experience of the vast majority of minority activists. This experience has often entailed, depending a lot on the activist's class origins, substantial material inequalities in terms of education, extent and scope of cultural experiences, etc. If such concrete factors are not taken into consideration, a profound racist dynamic is set up. A moral atmosphere is established with sweeping generalizations concerning minority experience, internalized oppression, etc., all of which has a decidedly racist undercurrent. For example, the insidious and usually unspoken assumption can gain sway that all minority activists have had a poor education and are ill-trained academically and theoretically, which is far from the truth. On the other hand, minority activists who may be functionally illiterate find very little consolation in mere moral outrage over the inferiority of ghetto and barrio schools if at the same time, the communist movement fails to provide any concrete assistance on how to begin to overcome this handicap step by step. A correct policy for cadre care and development is by its very nature principally individual. The whole point is for each cadre to be examined, given tasks and trained in light of the work at hand and their particular strengths, shortcomings, and experiences. Generalizations concerning the social dynamics of class, race, and sex should be utilized to inform and highlight the assessment of, and not as substitute for the inquiry into the particular life and history of the activist in question. Besides trying to formulate and implement such guidelines, movement groups conducted organization-wide educational or struggle campaigns if and when they identified patterns of racial insensitivity, tokenism, or the like. They also encouraged units to deal forthrightly with criticisms of individuals for chauvinist behavior when these were raised. Again, in this the movement continued a strand of new left as well as communist tradition. Much was learned from insights first popularized by SNCC activists concerning the subtle and not so subtle ways in which educated whites patronized, romanticized, intimidated, and otherwise disrespected the black people they were trying to assist during Mississippi Freedom Summer and similar efforts. A similar framework undergirded movement efforts to tackle sexism, but by and large the early Marxist-Leninist groups pursued this goal with less vigor and based on a relatively narrow view of what constituted women's oppression. As with theoretical analysis of women's oppression, several of the later party-building groups did much better. Still, less attention did not mean no attention. The October League, for instance, included the article Women and Party Building in the first issue of its theoretical journal in 1975, and included a section on its internal anti-sexist policies. The Marxist-Leninist Party does not organize women into separate groups within it and does not have separate womenist caucuses which might be found in unions or mass organizations. However, working groups and bodies must be established to oversee work among women, and particularly among the minority and working women. The Women's Commission also has the duty of seeing that those women brought into the OL are trained in Marxism-Leninism and equipped for their role in the struggle. All forms of discrimination and chauvinism against women and minority comrades must be opposed by the entire membership. It is also necessary that our party-building work take into account the special needs of women. This means attention must be paid to child raising and child care so that women can attend meetings and activities as well as being able to spend time with their children. Women who are not as politically advanced as their husbands must be carefully and patiently worked with and brought into the struggle. In other cases, special work must be done with the men whose wives are politically active. Special emphasis must be placed on the fight against male chauvinism within the ranks of the movement. This is the main roadblock to the participation of large numbers of women in our organizations. Certainly some of the assumptions on which the OL's policy was based, such as the premise that a husband-wife family arrangement is typical if not universal, would be challenged today, and was challenged by some at the time. That noted, the approach outlined above, common to most early party-building groups, facilitated the fuller participation of many women in activist life, and altered the attitudes and practices of many men. Without doubt there were struggles during which some white and or middle-class individuals were put on the spot and made to feel uneasy. Some of these individuals resented such treatment, and either at the time or later described their experiences as examples of how undemocratic and inhumane the movement was. In some cases these episodes were genuine horror stories, but more often than not such tales miss the forest for the trees and resemble today's backlash against affirmative action. The fact is that many movement groups stood out in terms of their ability to forge rapport and mutual trust across class and racial lines in a society, and a left, where such harmony is extremely rare. This cannot be accomplished without occasional times when those from more privileged backgrounds feel uncomfortable and are challenged to change some aspects of their behavior. Working class culture. The new communist movement worked overtime to present itself and actually become culturally an end of the proletariat. This was no simple task. Faced with a badly divided working class and fuzzy borders between the working class and other classes, it was hard to locate any kind of uniform or clear-cut working class culture. Within people of color communities there were identifiable cultures of resistance, and a few organizations had some success meshing into and helping sustain them. but there were few left-wing cultural milieus that simultaneously crossed racial lines and had a mass character. Some pockets remained from the 1930s and 1940s, but they were largely in and around the CPUSA and thus out of bounds to the new movement. Some groups, especially RU between 1971 and 1976, dealt with this issue by conjuring up an image of what a progressive working-class culture was supposed to be and then trying to fit their organization to that conception. The results were often clumsy, such as adopting cliched language and styles of dress from the 1930s, actually 1960s notions of the 1930s, or promoting a crude anti-intellectualism masquerading as hostility toward elitism. In combination with the movement's general ultra-leftism, this approach produced some truly stilted and out-of-the-past-looking newspapers and leaflets. On another level, the search for working-class culture led some groups to embrace a sweeping cultural conservatism, including mandates that married couples who live together must get married in order to fit in with normal working-class life, and strictures against homosexuality, again on the grounds that same-sex relationships were foreign to the working class. Besides simply being backward, such policies were counterproductive. They repelled many women, gays and lesbians, as well as large numbers of the most open-minded and rebellious straight male workers. Another prominent feature of the 1960s counterculture was drug use, and here the dominant policy was to forbid members' use of marijuana and psychedelics as well as all harder drugs. There were certainly good reasons for such policies, including the inherent health dangers of substance abuse as well as heightened threats from police, given that movement groups were often under a certain amount of police surveillance. But the frequently given argument that workers didn't like pot-smoking hippies included strong elements of backwardness and miscalculation as well. There were also serious problems with the movement's stance toward alcohol use, which in its early years ranged from complete tolerance to near encouragement on the grounds that drinking was part of working-class culture. Whatever the stated policies of a particular group, in practice alcohol abuse was a prevalent but hardly ever discussed problem. In part this mirrored the low level of attention the overall society then gave to alcoholism. It also reflected the common pattern of individuals under constant stress turning to alcohol or drugs in efforts to manage that stress, with negative if not disastrous results. Problems stemming from substance abuse were found from the base to the top leadership level in several groups, and the dynamics accompanying substance abuse tended to exaggerate a group's voluntarist tendencies and complicate the already serious problem of providing accountability and democracy within their hierarchical structures. The search for a strategy, the new communist movement gave high priority to tackling questions of strategy, which sectors of the working class were likely to play a leading role in the confrontation with capital. How can the movement best link different struggles as well as its short and long-term objectives? How should a small organization prioritize its activity so that it makes the most gains? There was no shortage of mechanical reasoning, but also sparks of creativity in the countless study groups, forums, central committee plenums, campaign sum-ups, and written polemics devoted to these matters. There were also tendencies again inherited both from the New Left and traditional communism to formulate hierarchies of whose oppression was the most important in order to settle strategic debates. The Marxist-Leninists who approached matters this way invariably argued that class and race had prime importance and that women's oppression was a secondary question. Some also insisted that the oppression of African Americans was more important than that of other peoples of color. As most of the left has learned over the last 20 years, there are fundamental flaws in this kind of logic. It pits one group's suffering against another's, focuses one-sidedly on the distinctions rather than the interconnections between oppressive relations, and sets itself the hopeless task of trying to rate different oppressions. Today, years of negative experiences with such mechanical thinking has led many activists to resist making any kind of distinctions or estimates whatsoever concerning the potential of different social sectors to bring about political change. Advocates of this view frequently appeal to postmodernism's claims that it is wrong to privilege any one movement or relationship over any other, but this view is also a dead end. Any serious political movement has to make judgments about which sector or movement at a given time can rally the greatest number of people, catalyze unity among diverse constituencies, and make the biggest dent in current power relations. Making such evaluations requires a concrete analysis of historically formed structures and social relations. A movement unwilling to probe such questions and set priorities accordingly limits itself to moral appeals for redress and acts of only temporary or symbolic value. It is crucial to distinguish between trying to establish a mechanical hierarchy of oppressions, which is a fatal error, and making grounded judgments about which sectors or movements are likely to exercise the greatest social leverage at specific times, which is essential. The new communist movement learned the importance of making such evaluations not just from Marxism, which after all bases itself on the proposition that the social location of the proletariat makes it the universal class, which can liberate itself only by ending all exploitation. The movement also drew this conclusion from its own cadres' experience, especially in the civil rights movement. Movement cadre understood that it was a set of specific historical conditions, including the huge concentration of African Americans in the South, the specific nature of Jim Crow, and the confluence of international circumstances, which made this the single movement capable of driving forward all others from the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s and beyond. Movement cadre debated such issues of strategy with great ferocity. Accusations that others within the movement, and elsewhere on the left, were selling out the revolution became commonplace. Leninism attached great importance to matters of theory, and Lenin himself wrote that the distinction between revolutionary and opportunist perspectives frequently lay in what seemed a mere shade of difference, so there was precedent for pitched battles over disagreements that, especially in retrospect, seem minor or even trivial. Movement debate was skewed not just by the perceived need to justify all positions as being consistent with Lenin's or Mao's writings, but by the belief that history was moving forward at a feverish clip and that the fate of the revolution was at stake in nearly every controversy, organizational competition and individual ambitions. The real politic behind some of the most ferocious fights didn't help matters, but sectarianism and careerism were more effect than cause. Movement activists constantly referred to periods like the 1960s they had just emerged from, when surging movements missed great opportunities because they lacked effective leadership, and they were convinced that identifying and breaking with all deviations from orthodoxy were crucial for avoiding this problem the next time around. Leadership, discipline, and democratic centralism. Movement culture valued strong leadership and tight discipline. This was consistent with long-standing communist tradition, but it was also a reaction against unstructured New Left organizations, which were often unable to make or carry out decisions and were frequently dominated by unaccountable media-created figures. It was taken as a given that leaders' exercise of power was a good thing, and that part of their task was to win over supposedly less developed cadre to an advanced viewpoint. The view of leaders as individuals who mainly facilitated the participation of others, which was advocated at the time mainly by the women's movement and has since gathered much broader support, was foreign to 1970s Marxism-Leninism. Leaders and members of Marxist-Leninist groups were bound together within Stalin-Mao models of democratic centralism, which gave far more weight to centralism than democracy. In their formative years, most groups displayed considerable flexibility, with lots of freewheeling discussion and experimentation, but as each group consolidated it became more uniform and rigid. The RU, for instance, codified a tight democratic centralism only after its first major internal split in 1970. Many groups turned to communist handbooks from the 1930s or drew on the recollections of CPUSA or PL veterans to design their structures. As a result, the larger groups, those dozen or so that managed to grow to upwards of 100 to 200 members, and in some cases up to 1,000 or more, were all organized in the same fundamental pattern. First and foremost, these organizations were activist. All members were required to belong to and take assignments from a party unit. At any given time, there were numerous organizational campaigns underway, and members were expected to participate in one or more of them. This usually meant attending meetings of party bodies devoted to that particular campaign in addition to a member's regular unit meeting. Different organizations called these cells clubs, base units, or nuclei. Units met anywhere from every week to every month. Most groups also required participation in ongoing study of Marxist-Leninist theory, though this might take place in unit meetings or periodic conferences rather than a regular weekly or monthly study group. All this internal activity was designed to coordinate, support, and guide members' external work, which involved going to meetings of unions or other popular organizations, conducting one-on-one discussions with contacts and potential recruits, distributing literature, and more. Even the least active cadre was busy 2 or 3 evenings a week and 1 morning or afternoon on the weekend, not counting the time spent earning a living. The typical cadre was busy roughly 4 evenings a week and 2 blocks of time during the weekend, and it wasn't unusual for the most hard-working to be doing either wage or political work the entire week except for Saturday night and Sunday morning. Such standards were manageable for activists who were young and without children. Parents had to do a great deal of juggling to participate even at the lower end of the scale. Though several groups did organize child care programs to spread out some of this burden, most cadre took a week or two off for a vacation each year, but some did not take even that much of a break. Second, movement organizations were disciplined. Members were accountable to conduct their work on the basis of group policy and to follow through on all their assigned tasks. Such unity in action was strictly enforced. It was justified not only as essential to get practical tasks accomplished, but as the best way to test out the value of a particular policy. If everyone did not pursue a common line, the argument went, the organization could never be sure if problems were due to the line being flawed or to half-hearted attempts to implement it. But group discipline went beyond such sensible arguments. Cadre were also responsible for defending their organization's positions in all circumstances, and usually prohibited from expressing differences or reservations to any non-member. Some groups even had rules forbidding members from expressing disagreements to cadre outside their base unit. Members also had to report on their work to their collectives and/or leadership bodies. Usually, verbal summaries would suffice, but a few groups required written reports, and a handful even had members fill out weekly time cards. Penalties for violating these policies ranged from a word of criticism to removal from any position of authority. For the most serious violations, a member could be expelled. Division of labor and hierarchy. Third, the new Marxist-Leninist groups functioned with a sophisticated division of labor and pronounced hierarchy. Even organizations with just 100 or so members developed complex structures enabling the group to take up many tasks simultaneously. A typical group had base units where members discussed overall policy and paid dues, cells sometimes coinciding with the base units that guided the work of all members in a particular union, workplace, or community, and fractions, long-lasting or temporary, directing cadre assigned to a specific campaign or mass organization. Often cells or fractions were linked in a nationwide commission that set policy and directed work in a particular arena, Trade Union Commission, Black Liberation Commission, and so on. Most groups also had some kind of apparatus in and around their nationwide headquarters that did research, linked the central leadership with local bodies, issued an internal bulletin, and so on. Several of these included international liaison departments to develop and maintain ties with counterpart organizations in other countries. These mostly consisted of sending delegations or solidarity statements to each other's congresses, occasionally holding meetings to talk over political questions, and the regular exchange of publications. To exercise week-to-week leadership, the larger groups generally had some kind of central body of 5 to 12 people located at the national headquarters, usually termed a political bureau or executive committee. Sometimes real power rested with an even smaller subgroup dubbed a standing committee or co-chairs collective. The executive committee exercised authority both through its control of commissions and the central apparatus, and via its role as formal leadership of a broader central committee. Central committees typically met every 3 to 6 months and included comrades from across the country, and were in some fashion representative of, if not directly elected by, the membership. In theory, all executive committees were subordinate to the larger central committee, but in practice central committees were relegated to a relatively passive role except in periods of internal upheaval. Executive committees typically retained authority to choose which individuals would be assigned to the most important organizational posts, including the newspaper, theoretical journal, and internal bulletin editors. Those individuals, usually members of the executive committee themselves, shaped the way an organization's views would be presented in public and to the membership. In most groups, it was standard practice for top leadership bodies to present a picture of unanimity, keeping whatever disagreements they had secret from the membership. Nominally, the highest body in a Marxist-Leninist group was an organization-wide congress, usually held every 2 or 3 years. At these gatherings, delegates elected by the members were supposed to assemble and determine all fundamental matters of policy, as well as select the central committee. But the short life of most groups meant few held more than 2 or 3 congresses in their entire existence. In practice, central committees were chosen in a variety of ways, sometimes by members in each local area electing their representatives without an organization-wide congress, and sometimes without elections at all. In those cases, an executive committee set up when an organization was still small and concentrated in 1 or 2 cities would simply appoint individuals to serve. Usually the particulars of a group's structure and procedures were set down in some kind of constitution that accompanied the grow-ups program or points of unity. Most groups required new recruits to take a study course in Marxism-Leninism and the organization's particular line and policies. Usually there was some kind of probationary period, 3 to 6 months. during which the candidate member functioned within a party unit and was oriented to the organization's procedures. How an individual gravitating toward the movement came to affiliate with one group as opposed to another was often a matter of accident. Each group had skilled and less skilled organizers, and for individuals unfamiliar with the fine points of Marxist doctrine, which type you met was often far more important than a particular group's line on any given issue. Sometimes the choice was determined by accidents, like which doorway a curious activist happened to enter. In San Francisco's Chinatown, the Asian Community Center, which became dominated by the Arya-linked Mao and Che, then its bookstore were across the International Hotel entranceway from the IWK-connected Chinese Progressive Association headquarters. The Kalayan office was around the corner. Just about every group devoted a large portion of its resources to producing literature. Many published pamphlets, several produced theoretical journals or magazines, the largest set up publishing houses and issued books, and the overwhelming majority published a newspaper. In What Is to Be Done, Lenin had likened a newspaper to the scaffolding in constructing a building and argued that it was an indispensable tool for shaping the party's outlook, uniting its ranks and spreading its influence. Movement groups universally embraced this perspective. Even collectives with as few as a dozen or two members made producing a newspaper one of their top priorities. Movement papers ranged from amateurish 4-page handouts to much thicker weeklies, and came out anywhere from every other month to every week. A significant number included sections, ranging from a few pages to an equal half of each issue, in Spanish, and one or two in Chinese. Another organizational practice was the attempt to plan all aspects of political work, both by setting long-term goals and meticulously detailing day-to-day tactics. The party-building categories of theory, unity, and fusion served as guidelines. At times these categories were applied rigidly and contributed to sectarianism. For example, they included no distinct reference to forging cooperative relations with other left trends, which buttressed the tendency to classify all activists outside the party-building movement as opportunists. But when used more flexibly, these categories were extremely useful. They helped different groups determine which aspect of their development was running ahead or lagging behind the others, and made it easier for cadre to exchange experiences and draw lessons. 6-month to 1-year plans with concrete objectives, mobilizing a certain number of people to a demonstration, recruiting a certain number of new members, and so forth, were standard practice. Most groups went even further, guiding cadres' work right down to minute details, at least in priority sectors and campaigns. Which activists would say exactly what at a particular event, which contact a cadre should take to dinner before a key union meeting, precisely how to approach a discussion about racism with a militant but racially insensitive white worker. Such things were poured over collectively, and cadre were provided with point-by-point instructions. The Marxist-Leninists knew that bourgeois politicians, trade union leaderships, and their agents operated in this fashion, and as professional revolutionaries they were committed to matching their class rivals. Such painstaking care yielded the desired results on many occasions. Through years of such attention to detail, movement groups trained some top-notch political tacticians, at least within the movement's organizing model. That model placed great importance on convincing people to agree with a certain set of ideas and persuading them to join either a Marxist-Leninist group or a mass organization under its leadership. In other words, winning people's allegiance to a particular line and organizational center were the key measures of success. Most of the movement gave little attention to or actually opposed the development of forms reflecting bottom-up initiative and working-class self-organization outside party control. Likewise, most groups attached little importance to development of grassroots leadership skills that were not linked to an immediate campaign. Tactics were oriented toward winning a particular reform or policy outcome and expanding the influence of the organization in its line. Alternatives stressing the long-term development of working-class institutions and leaders that might or might not agree with the specific policy of a specific group at a specific time were not part of the movement's vision. Unity in action versus unity of thought. Not surprisingly, most groups gave high priority to consolidating the membership around the organization's line. After a group passed through its formative stage, its leaders typically monitored every nuance of base activists' views. When they noticed a member with differing opinions, it was not uncommon to make detailed plans for dinners, informal late-night chats, and, if necessary, full-blown struggle sessions to bring that person into line. Largely through such means, a stress on unity of thought and not simply unity in action became dominant. This was not written down in official documents, which mostly repeated formulas about individuals' right to argue for dissenting views as long as they followed proper channels and maintained unity in action. But after a few freewheeling years, such flexibility existed mostly on paper. Dissenters were either brought into line, pressured to quit, or expelled. The movement's voting practices facilitated this negative phenomenon. While formally all groups adhered to the principle of majority rule, in practice there was a strong tendency to function on the basis of consensus. The positive side of this, prominent early on, was that important questions were given thorough discussion and members' opinions were given a hearing, but over time the negatives predominated. There was tremendous pressure on everyone to agree, and members did not gain the experience of losing a vote one week, continuing to work harmoniously with their comrades, and being in the majority on some other issue the next week. It is through such experiences that activists learn to function on the basis of a genuine distinction between unity in action and unity of thought, and organizations develop the capacity to foster solidarity and trust among members who are not of one mind. When such experiences are short-circuited and these skills are not learned, organizations are prone to split the first time any serious internal disagreement comes up. Movement groups took very seriously the proposition that as revolutionaries they were targeted for state infiltration and repression, as indeed they were. Cadre were acutely aware that they also faced employer blacklists and right-wing harassment, thus they practiced a measure of secrecy and security. Mainly this meant surfacing only a few cadre as open communists. The rest were closed members who would advocate left politics but not reveal their organizational membership except under limited, collectively determined circumstances. Many groups developed extremely detailed policies in this area. A common pattern was to surface one person after he or she had passed the probationary period in force at most factories, and to leave other members at that workplace closed. This was regarded as the best combination for minimizing harassment while defending the right of communists to participate in working-class life and combating the anti-communism prevalent even among militant workers. Some groups also had a category of secret members, activists with especially sensitive positioning in a union or elsewhere whose membership was known only by a handful of central leaders. Several groups also insisted that members use special party names to identify themselves in internal documents or organizational meetings. These were designed to protect members' identities from any police agents who might have successfully infiltrated the organization. With few and short-lived exceptions, all groups concentrated their attention on mass, legal and public forms of organizing. Despite doctrinal insistence that violent revolution was a cutting-edge demarcation with revisionism, movement groups did not treat preparing for insurrection as an immediate practical question, and they devoted little if any attention to building an apparatus capable of underground or protracted armed activity. In this case, good judgment about the actual level of the class struggle prevailed over doctrinal speculation. Several organizations did set up security teams to serve as bodyguards for organized INL leaders or important visitors from other countries. Many saw the need for at least some of their cadre, for instance, those directly involved in Southern campaigns against the Ku Klux Klan, to be prepared for armed self-defense but opposed small group violent actions separated from the mass struggle. Toward that end they encouraged cadre to procure small arms and conducted various kinds of training programs in their use, but all these were distinctly secondary aspects of movement practice. Finally, there was the matter of finances. The central leadership of most groups were put on salary so they could conduct political work full-time. It was also considered desirable to give a stipend to key members of the national staff, most frequently those putting out the newspaper, and where possible to regional or local leaders. Even though movement groups paid only subsistence wages, the expenses added up. It also cost a great deal to put out literature, since no newspaper or journal broke even through subscription and sales income alone. Travel and communication across the country also required funds. Overwhelmingly, the money to pay these expenses came directly from a group's membership and immediate periphery. The biggest portion came from regular dues, which in most groups were quite substantial. Graduated due systems were common, with members paying anywhere from 2 or 3% of their monthly income up to 10 or even 20% for those who were better off. On top of dues, there were regular fundraising campaigns where members were encouraged to donate extra dollars, and appeals were made to the group's periphery. All the larger organizations benefited at least once or twice from windfall donations coming from members or supporters from wealthier backgrounds who had come into large inheritances. Many such people had been radicalized in the 1960s, and the ones who gravitated toward Marxism-Leninism were among the most generous. One or two groups raised some funds by selling newspaper subscriptions in large quantities to China. but in no case was this a significant proportion of an organization's income. No movement group relied upon foundation grants or support from liberal individuals. These were self-supporting organizations, funded by people who shared each group's politics. This fact was crucial in allowing them to maintain their revolutionary character and political independence. Obviously, the smaller groups, local collectives of a dozen or 24 members, were too small to develop such complex structures or accumulate so many resources. But even most of these adopted a rudimentary form of democratic centralism that included a leadership collective, division of labor, units and fractions, primitive security measures, and regular propaganda. And like their larger counterparts, they were able to conduct a tremendous amount of work per member and establish a presence far beyond their numbers. The need for revolutionary cadre. In the end, the combination of a culture infused with voluntarism and an organizational model based in top-down decision-making proved disastrous, but in delineating the flaws in the movement's model, it would be a mistake to reject all of its component parts. Revolutionary spirit, hard work, personal sacrifice, and the willingness to subordinate individual interests to the political tasks at hand are all crucial qualities for a successful radical movement. So too is the commitment to sink roots among the exploited and oppressed and to struggle within the movement over inequalities of class, race, and gender. And whether or not they are now in fashion, so are organizations capable of functioning on the basis of well-worked-out strategies, unity in action, and a measure of collective discipline. What's more, such qualities and attempts to build organizations which embody them rise whenever large numbers of people mount a sustained challenge to the powers that be. Even in periods of political ebb, there are pockets of activists who aspire to become revolutionary activists. Unless the upcoming decades are crisis and conflict-free, an unlikely prospect, larger numbers are likely to take a similar course. The new communist movement was born at a time when Marxism-Leninism was the world's dominant revolutionary pole, so it turned to a version of Leninist democratic centralism to channel its dedication and energy. In the short term, it achieved remarkable results in stimulating cadre to study and organize, in providing recruits with many new skills, in building solidarity among activists across class, racial, and gender lines, and in building organizations able to exert influence far beyond their numbers. The fact that no movement organization could sustain such positive features over the long haul indicates that a better way of political organization than Stalinist hierarchy needs to be found. But the underlying project, cohering revolutionary-minded activists into a collective body of cadre, remains a crucial task for constructing any effective left.